Right, welcome indeed to this month's Wellington Trust lecture.
A gallery view.
Is my brother there?
Hello.
Your brother. Well done, Richard.
Good evening.
I wonder if I could just ask you, first of all, if you could very kindly, Michael Shuttleworth, welcome to the show. Could you possibly now turn off your buttons?
Okay.
If you can turn off if you can mute.
Your button.
Okay.
How do I
Getting a
mute?
lot of feedback. And,
Just answer the question.
yeah, sure. Well done. Okay. And probably, I'll come on to it in a minute, but we'll have something to say about bandwidth as well. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. It's really good, and welcome
You want
to.
to come, man?
I think we've got someone who's still turned on. Would they like to just turn off if you're still there?
Do they want their videos off?
Okay. No, that's right. Could you also turn your videos off if that's possible, please? Until the end. Well, towards the end of it, as I will say, we can turn on microphones, turn on video, and have a chat and a glass of wine, hopefully. We'll all be there. Very good indeed. Welcome everybody to this Wellington Trust lecture given by the Friends of the Wellington, but also extended very warmly welcome to other organisations, individuals as well. And this month I would particularly welcome the City Naval Club, who have been added to the list of circulations. If I may, I'm still hearing somebody talk. I wonder, please, if you could mute your button. Yeah, I'm getting a conversation. Could we possibly try and mute buttons, please? Because it's going to be very difficult for Richard, our guest speaker, to be able to speak with that going on. Thank you very, very much indeed. There we are. Tonight's lecture is on the Battle of Taranto, which took place on the 11th of November 1940. With great pleasure, I welcome you all. And in a minute, I will just tell you a bit more about our speaker. Jenny, next page, please. I think we still have somebody who has turned on. If it's possible, just to mute your button, please. Thank you very much. Okay.
Whoever is the host can do a mute all. That will work.
The only thing is that will actually mute some that we don't want to mute as well, which would include me, although that might be a very good idea.
You could then unmute individually.
Okay, thanks. We'll carry on anyway and see how we get on. As I've just said, if you can turn your video off, that will be good because that'll probably help with the bandwidth. We will be having questions at the end, comme d'habitude, and it is the way to do that. If you would like to do a question, is you will see, hopefully at the bottom of your screens, sometimes at the top, a chat box, and in it you will see the choice of actually sending the message to everyone or just sending it to a particular name. Please make sure if you're sending a message that it's actually sent to everyone, although it will actually be collected by one person who's collecting the questions. You can then minimize or close down your chat box by clicking the cross in the top right-hand corner. There will be, and indeed there is now a recording going on of this lecture, and you will be sent a link afterwards, so you may, if you would, keep it or listen to it afterwards. I wonder if
We have the keys over the box of moves, and that's that.
Just
somebody has still got their button unmuted.
complete disaster.
Could it be possible? Right, Matt, if I may come in.
No, never mind. All right.
Can we mute everyone and then unmute those who are able to?
Right.
Hi, Alistair. The best thing to do is just to mute everybody and then unmute yourself. And
right, okay.
Yeah.
We are able to unmute, are we? Okay.
Yes, you can unmute people one by one.
Right. Okay. So, good. I'm so sorry about this, people, but obviously we don't want to have two conversations going on during the lecture. Are you able to mute everyone for me, or has it got to be someone who's got?
It's going to be Fee or Jenny.
Right, Jenny or Fee. Jenny, would you perhaps? So sorry to this technical notes. Could you actually mute everybody, and then hopefully we'll be able to unmute ourselves.
Should be done.
Okay. Okay, is that now done? Right. Now, to Richard, can you all hear me okay? Jenny, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, that's fine. Sorry about the slow start, but obviously that was quite important to get sound. I'm very very happy to welcome my old friend Richard Shuttleworth as our guest speaker tonight. Richard has an interesting CV, and I'm going to take a little time just to read it, if I may. He is the son of a Royal Naval signals officer who was pressed during the war into becoming a swordfish observer. His father was under training at the time of the Battle of Taranto and witnessed the Battle of Matapan a few months later. This is in 1940. Hello. His only brother would be killed flying a Blenheim off Rotterdam in August 1941. Richards is brother to 4 naval officers, 1 Royal Marine officer, and a cavalry officer, all serving the Queen very well. Three of them were Fleet Air Arm helicopter pilots between 57 and 62. Now, Richard was educated at Nautical College, Pangbourne. In 62, he joined Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth as a career seaman officer with his twin brother, Ian Shuttleworth. Between 63 and 67, he served in 3 ships operating from the West Indies to the Far East. He was attracted to flying, having been in a mine hunter, that's a coastal mine sweeper converted to a mine hunter, which was fitted as a gunboat during confrontation in Borneo between the years 66 and 68. Very hot year. With the confrontation was with Indonesia, and it was, as he describes, now almost a mini war where helicopters were used. Between 68 and 70, Richard flew Royal Marines in the commando role in Wessex helicopters in the Arctic and Mediterranean from the commando carrier HMS Albion.
On there.
Would someone please, possibly if they can hear this, turn off their music?
Well, I can listen to it while I'm changing your bed.
Right, that's fine. Good. But also, would you listen with your mute button off? Thank you very much. In 72, Richard flew Wasp helicopters from the back of small frigates, and he retired from the Royal Navy at his own request in 1974. Between 74 and 76, he flew a desk in the City of London as a shipbroker working for Galbraith Wrightson. 2 years, I think, was enough, Richard, as I understand. Yeah, good. 76 to 1988, Richard flew many different helicopters, including Huey Bell's, the Bell helicopters of Vietnam fame. We remember those very well. And it was flying fixed-wing aircraft on a paramilitary organization for a paramilitary organization in the Persian Gulf. That was part of the Royal Oman Police. 88 to 2009, Richard, being one of the first pilots recruited for this purpose, flew London's Air Ambulance, which is, we know, a charity, and retired after over 40 years of flying with more than 10,000 flying hours to his name in 2009. Since 2009 onwards, if he had anything to do rather than retire, he was doing occasional talking in cruise ships and was driving professionally. And I remember in those days, Richard, you must have been an extremely highly qualified driver. Richard is an upper freeman of the Honourable Company of Air Pilots, which you note is an honourable company, as is the Honourable Company Master Mariners. And he is a friend of the Wellington and a member of the Goldfish Club, more of that anon, maybe, the City Naval Club and the Seven Seas Club. With that, no more ado, and over to you, Richard, for what I hope will be an extremely, and I believe, will be a very good talk.
Everybody, you've probably, most of the naval chaps, and I see there's quite a lot of Fleet Air Arm people there. 2 of my brothers
Swordfish
will be, sorry, is somebody else talking?
Yeah, I wonder, possibly, somebody is talking, and it's a bit distracting for Richard and everybody. Could you please all make sure that your mute button is, your microphone, little icon is turned off. You do that by clicking on the icon that shows a microphone. Sorry, Richard, continue.
There's one that says Nigel's iPad Pro. I can see that's on. whoever that is.
Okay.
Okay, well, this is basically something I've always been interested in, because when I was at Culdrose, the Flag Officer Naval Air Command was Sir Richard Shuttleworth, who was actually an observer on the raid itself, sitting in the back, and he survived to become a Vice Admiral, and his son, Robin Shuttleworth, joined the Navy just after me, and he retired, having been the Queen's Equerry as Lord Shuttleworth. So there were quite a lot of the old boys still around who were always happy to talk about this. And the other thing in particular is, although I've never been in a Swordfish, there were still a couple left down at Yeovilton, I felt flying a Wasp at 100 knots and 100 feet over the sea, if you could get 100 knots, with a torpedo, must have felt rather the same, you know, because it was quite cold and doors were open and everything else. Anyway, I'll move on to the next slide.
You should be able to do it, Richard.
I press the button.
Click on the screen, Richard. They're up.
There we go. Oh, it's gone too. Fleet Arm. Thought I'd start off with a little bit about the Fleet Arm, because I know there are a lot of non-naval and non-Fleet Arm, especially in the audience. You might like to know what it was all about. It was only 5 years after the first flight by Orville and Wright in 1904, and they offered the patents to some of their machines to the Navy, but they politely declined. The only person in the Royal Navy who was interested at all was Admiral Sir John Jackie Fisher, who was a big gun man in his 60s, but incredibly forward-thinking. But the rest of the Navy was still thinking about big guns, and aircraft were not really in their sights at all. In 1908, Blériot flew across the Channel, and they realized you could go across water, and in 1909 formed the Fleet Air Arm. First vessel was the Mayfly, named that by the lower deck, I believe, but Barrow in Furness. She never did fly, actually, because she came out of a hangar, gust of wind caught her, and she broke her back, having taken 2 years to build her. But they'd been forced to do this because the Germans had Zeppelins. Some Royal Aero Club members, a chap called Francis McLean and a Mr. Coburn, offered aircraft training down at Eastchurch in Sheppey, off their own back, and 4 were finally selected out of 200. They were Mr. Gregory, Longmore, Davison and Gerard, who was Royal Marine Light Infantry. So right at the beginning, my older brother will be pleased, there was a Royal Marine involved in naval aviation. A Commander Swan built a float plane. A lot of it was fairly amateur. And the first real accident that was had was a chap called Sampson, who was a squadron commander, who was, I beg your pardon, Squadron Commander Edward Dunning, who was killed flying a Sopwith pup. They didn't have any aircraft carriers. They put a deck on the forward guns of HMS Africa, and he took off, flew off that, but the following day he did the same thing, and a gust of wind came under this dummy deck and lost lift on one wing, went into the sea and was killed, which is all very sad. So really the first naval accident. Anyway, they formed the Royal Flying Corps in 1912, and in 1914 the naval wing of it became the Royal Naval Air Service. Thanks to Mr. Churchill, who was actually quite, again, forward-thinking, because it was not considered necessary to have 2 services. Anyway, later on, as you'll see, we had to go back to being 1, which was a bit of a disaster. By the end of the war, there were 2,949 aircraft and 103 airships. So it was quite big. And right at the end of the war, though the RAF don't always like it mentioned, on the 1st of April 1918, the Royal Air Force was formed. So it's nearly 10 years younger than the Fleet Air Arm. And then in 1924, they decided that the whole thing was unmanageable by just the whole of the RAF. And I don't think the Navy particularly liked having just pilots who'd been taught to fly RAF aircraft who weren't particularly trained in what you had to do on board a ship. So they managed to get the fleet arm reformed, which came under naval control just in time for the Second World War. Is it going to go?
Don't go too fast.
I pressed it once. Shall I press it again?
Click on the screen, Richard.
Doing that.
Jenny.
Fee, can you take over?
Doesn't seem to want to move.
I'm trying. Oh, there we go.
Thanks.
Bottom left corner.
Oh,
Bottom left corner, folks. Yeah.
try that. Yep. That's better than the buttons. Thanks. Okay, the people involved at the time, the First Sea Lord was Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, who had been Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, quite elderly and not very well, but up in the Admiralty, and not wildly interested in aviation. Admiral Sir Andrew Brown Cunningham, who was Commander-in-Chief Med, known as ABC by all his minions, was a very senior First World War admiral, well, First World War naval officer, interested in big guns, but rapidly came round to the use of aviation. And he had a very competent Rear Admiral carriers, Sir Lumley Lister, who commanded Glorious in the 1930s. He had also considered attacking Taranto when the Italians invaded Abyssinia in 1935, and he built up a plan to how to attack Taranto, but it had to be modified, as we'll see later, because there were some things that he wouldn't have expected. Captain Dennis Boyd had been present at Jutland in a destroyer flotilla, and he was very experienced, again, very well liked. This is Andrew Cunningham here, known as ABC, very formal, old-fashioned officer. And when submarines went past him in Alexandria, he used to tick them off because they were scruffily dressed, even though they were using a correct rig, with pullovers and things like that. And that little statue of him's in Trafalgar Square, just in front of the National Gallery. The position of the ships at the time, of the other ships, I haven't mentioned any of them, but Illustrious broke off with a little, oh, it's keeping going. Illustrious broke off and went up towards Corfu, where they decided to launch the thing. It was about 180 miles. The aircraft didn't have, they had just about enough range to get there and back, but they decided they would add another tank, and that was 60 gallons, which had its own problems. But and another little force went up into the gap near Tirana in Albania, because the Italians were supplying their Albanian forces from Bari.
Can you go back to home?
That's where you see Taranto in the heel of the Gulf of Taranto, at the bottom of the boot. So it's very effective for controlling the Mediterranean. This was Taranto Harbour, roughly what it was on the day of the...
We might be able to start it from the...
Sorry, somebody shouting. Taranto Harbour in the inner harbour, the Mar Piccolo. There were two harbours. The big one, the main bay with breakwaters and an island, was Mar Grande, and Mar Piccolo, the little bay, was this is the way they had their ships. So very difficult to sink. You could sink the outer ones perhaps with torpedoes, but it wouldn't do any damage to the other ones. And the fore and aft attack would be lucky if you hit it at all. So they knew, the Italians certainly knew what they were doing. They weren't stupid at all. That's what it looked like at the time of the attack, with a little canal, they called it the canal, that went between the inner harbour to to the top there in the outer harbour where the battleships were. And that's what it looks like today, roughly. Not greatly changed, the little canals there, not quite so many ships in. I'm not a politician, but I just thought you ought to know that what was going on. Italy declared war on the 10th of June 1940, which was a stupid thing for Mussolini to do. I don't think he really thought it through. And they actually had a bigger fleet than the Royal Navy had in the Med, although it was smaller overall. But it was quite sizable. Italy obviously wanted to defend its own supply routes down towards Abyssinia, and we wanted to keep the Med open to our outfits out in the Far East. So they were quite dangerous. And of course, it wasn't helped when France signed the armistice a couple of weeks later. The opposition was the Royal Navy, the Italian Royal Navy, and the Italian Royal Air Force. This is what we had at the time, with Lumley Lister leading it. One aircraft carrier Eagle, which was very old and actually didn't in the end take full part because she'd been bombed and mined so many times that her fuel lines were bent, and they eventually transferred some of her Swordfish over to Illustrious. So instead of having 30 available, we ended up with originally 24, but they got less than that in the end. 3 battleships, none of which were particularly new, 7 cruisers of various sorts, and you can see what the rest are. And Illustrious, fortunately, had just completed her training and was sent out to relieve the Argus at the end of the Mediterranean, and the Argus went home to be a training vessel. And then the Illustrious carried on through, and Art Royal was left Force H at the Gibraltar end, and she carried on down to join Eagle in Alexandria, and then they were running convoys backwards and forwards, Alexandria to Malta, and then Force H would take them the rest of the way. And the Italian fleet had 6 battleships. 2 were quite modern, Vittoria Veneta and the Littoria, but the rest were old ones being modernised. But they were faster than ours, and they had slightly bigger guns as well. And I don't know what they did with 105 submarines. I wouldn't have thought there was room in the Mediterranean for them, but there were a lot of them. There's the old Illustrious, Illusti, fine vessel, just about brand new at the time. Great thing about her was she had a 3-inch armoured deck and 4.5-inch armour plating around the side. And until then, most carriers had wooden decks, and the Americans did, as they discovered the bad luck out in the Far East towards the end of the war with kamikazes. They still had wooden decks. But Illustrious took an awful lot of punishment. That's Illustrious, again, commissioned in 1940, carried 15 ferry fawners, which were rather slow. They looked a little bit like a large Hurricane, but they had folding wings, and they were offered to the Navy, but of course the Navy then changed the design, saying they wanted an observer in the back, which meant they were far too heavy. They climbed very slowly, and they only went, they did about 230 knots, and yet they did quite well against the Italian Air Force because they could be guided on, because the Illustrious had radar, which the Italians didn't, and they were quite robust, but they really were out of date. And that's the size of the old ship. There she is, another view of the Swordfish on the deck. She had a catapult as well, just one. It's a bit more of what she had. In those days, twin 4.5-inch A&A guns and two multiple pom-poms, which were 40-60, I think they were, but they were called pom-poms, Chicago pianos, because of what they sounded like. I don't know how effective they were, but they fired lots of shells into the air. And twin 4.5 inches AA guns must have been quite something. A lift at either end, and she had a homing beacon, which was extremely necessary after Taranto because the aircraft didn't have much except dead reckoning. And there's the good old string bag, called that because of the bag that ladies used to use when shopping, which they could just about get everything in. And it was a TSR, called TSR, not like the one in the 80s. It's TSR, which meant torpedo spotting reconnaissance, but they did everything else, bit of bombing as well. See the bomb racks under the wings there. This one's not actually carrying a torpedo. 45 feet wide, but obviously folded up, which was good, like the former did, roughly the same size actually, and about half the speed. She did about 120 knots, which is about the same as an anti-submarine helicopter would do now if they're lucky, and had about the same range and really very similar. And in fact, when Illustrious went out to America to do some trials before she went off to the Mediterranean, that's what a US Navy officer said when he saw the Swordfish. Where did that come from? And the chap said, fairies. And this wise gag said, that figures. Anyway, fine old, she looked really antiquated, but they were remarkably robust. They could dive like a Stuka and get up to about 180 miles an hour, but then the wires and the two wings and drag was so great. But they could dive pretty steeply without too much problem, which is exactly what they tried to do at Taranto once they came down from 8,000 feet down to about 100 feet and less. 546 miles, but with a tank, which they put on, they had about 1,000-mile range. There she is again with a torpedo underneath. The great thing about this was, and the Italians didn't know it, because they didn't lower their nets far enough, they had a duplex trigger. It could be either triggered by contact, which wouldn't necessarily be much good against an armoured battleship, but if it went underneath, which they would try to make them do, 33 feet, it would explode underneath this great magnetic mass of iron. And there's the Fulmar. As you can see, it looks a little like a large Hurricane. Fairies, again, with that observer's bit in the back. Heavy, slow, but it did a jolly good job. It was just the right aircraft because the Italians didn't actually have anything better. There she is, twice the speed of a Swordfish, but still 100 miles an hour, 100 knots slower than a Spitfire or a Hurricane or even a Stuka. But quite a long range and did a jolly good job. There she is folded at Yeovilton in the museum. Quite a large aircraft. Now these are interesting because they were offered to France, and when France fell in June 1940, they offered them to the Royal Air Force. And somebody smart in the Admiralty said, hang on a minute, we'll have 3 of those. We need them down in the Med. So they were sent down to the Mediterranean, flown by the RAF, and they did a tremendous job of reconnaissance. And a fine vessel. That's roughly the size. I don't want to go too much into it. Quite a long range and armed, but not particularly not used in fighting at all. Now this is the Italian battle fleet, or the battleships. I haven't shown you their other vessels, but she was a World War I modernised, and the Caio Giulio, which was eventually sunk. When I say sunk, they were all the ones that were sunk were actually raised. Some of them were raised within a week. And, but they were certainly put out of action that night. 10, 12.5-inch guns, faster than our ship, and quite a threat. Conte de Trafalgar was sunk, and the Julius Caesar was her sister ship. She was there. And Vittoria Veneta was undamaged. She was behind a net and wasn't damaged, and she took part in the Battle of Matapan. It wasn't sunk there either, but she did a dirty dart back to Taranto, and then there we go. Before she was sunk, also at Taranto, all 6 of them were there, which was absolutely extraordinary because they only saw 5 the day before, and the following day there were 6 in there. It's almost as if the Italians had brought them in specially. Navy, being a romantic service, decided that Trafalgar Day would be perfect, and the moon was correct. But Illustrious had a hangar fire when they were fitting the extra fuel tanks, and somebody apparently dropped a spanner or caught a contact, and 2 were destroyed and another 5 were damaged. So Illustrious was a bit of a mess for a couple of days. And then the Eagle, as I said earlier, had fuel supply problems after her various amounts of bomb damage she got in July 1940. So 5 of her Swordfish were sent over to Illustrious, making up to 24. And that was what was planned to go to Taranto, but as we'll find out, it didn't. A Swordfish was sent off to Cairo with RAF intelligence photos of Taranto. A chap called Pollock, who was in the staff at on the ship, but he had been in Alexandria and gone down to Cairo to look at the RAF pictures. Now, they wouldn't let him take them away, but he stole them and took them down to Alexandria, showed them to the ship, and then replaced them, and the RAF never knew they'd been stolen. Sorry, that changed again. This is the day, couple of days before the action. Couple of days before the action, the Swordfish engine failed after takeoff, and nobody knew quite why. Warspite recovered the crew and sent them back to Illustrious, so we're now down to 23. Then on the day before, another Swordfish was lost, and the crew came back. The Italians tried to find out where the ship was, but the Fulmars drove her off, so they never did find her. And again, later on in the afternoon as well. On the 11th, on the actual day, another Swordfish crashed. Now, this was beginning to become quite serious. And Streamline Robertson, who was the commander flying, he was known as Streamline because he was very good at getting aircraft and problems solved very quickly. But he also had a very aquiline nose, and I think that's probably what the sailors thought he was called Streamline for. He was a remarkable man. He inspected all the aircraft, cleaned out all their pipes and tanks in the afternoon of the 11th of November, the day that it was all going to happen. And then, as they were detaching, Vice Admiral Prudden Whipple detached the mouth of the Adriatic to do a bit of damage up there. That is the photographs brought back from the day before. There were five battleships in there. The other one hadn't arrived. So those are the sort of pictures the crews had to work from, and they're not very clear. The original plan was to, on wave 1, I haven't got the wave 2 on here, wave 1 was to come in from St. Peter Island, straight over the top, see if they could torpedo the ships in the harbour, and the other half of the wave would go slightly to starboard and attack the ships there. On those moles, you can see the mole at the top, all the way down to St. Peter Island and down. There were anti-aircraft batteries, the same on the outer mole at the bottom. And on the inner one, they discovered that day from the pictures that there were barrage balloons and there were nets as well, which in 1935 they didn't know anything about. In fact, it was only because Pollock had done a 3D course on how to read photographs that he realized those white blobs were barrage balloons. Otherwise, it would have been a complete disaster. That's a barrage balloon. They put up 90, and fortunately for us, 60 were destroyed. So There were only, actually at the time, I think there were 27 in place. So that was another thing, because they were about 150 feet apart, and a swordfish is only about half that in width, so, or a third of that, so and a good chance of getting between them if they could see them at night. This is slightly more detail. Keeps going fast, sorry. I think I'll stick with that. See if I can get back one slide. Now, yep, that's they launched at 8 o'clock, the first wave, and 12 aircraft in the end, and they were going to have 9 in the second wave. And they approached from the southwest, as I've said, and the flare aircraft went off to the east. So it was, and it was a nice moonlit night. They flew at 10,000 feet. On the way out, they climbed up through cloud, and some of them got separated. And from what I remember, with no instruments and everything else, if you went into cloud, the leader aircraft continued on, and the others peeled off to whichever side they were at. So you didn't collide. And then they had to dive from 10,000 feet down to 150 feet. Flew 300 yards apart, wingspan of 15 yards, plenty of room, and the water was 65 feet deep, and they had to be dropped not less than 300 yards, but actually they wound down the little propellers the torpedoes had, so they'd actually armed slightly earlier, slightly more dangerous for the aircraft, but I don't think they were too worried about that. And the Italians, even though they hadn't got radar, they had listening devices all the way around Taranto, and they could hear something was happening. They heard a Sunderland go over the top. They heard some of the other aircraft going over, spotting aircraft. They even heard one of the Swordfish, which got lost in cloud, got there early, about 15 minutes early, and circled. And they had no idea what was happening. So they just fired up occasionally, warning shots, and then of course when the flares went off, they fired at the flares, so which was a good thing because they didn't really want to fire at the aircraft. And so it was a hell of an AA barrage from about 10 to 11, and unfortunately Williamson, who went in first, torpedoed the Conte de Cavour, which I think you can see there, and he crashed just between the Lampo and the Fiumone. Fortunately, he and his observer survived. They were picked up, taken ashore, given a bit of a dusting over, but they were very well treated after that, and they had no complaints. A couple of torpedoes missed, I'm not surprised, and one hit the Littorio, which was up about in the middle there. That's a slightly better picture. You can see the Littorio was hit and Conte de Cavour. But the Caio Duilio and the Julius Caesar there was a net as well in front of them with Gorizia and Zara in there. And you can see the paths of the various ships that went. The E at the back, by the way, is the Eagle, and an Eagle aircraft, and L is an illustrious one, as on the side letters. So 9:30, the second lot went, and that's far more dangerous because although there were only 9 of them, of course the Italians, if they hadn't known they were coming, certainly did. And in fact, navigating to Taranto from down near Corfu was made quite easy because it was like joining on the. In fact, one of the observers said, "Have we got the wrong night?" Because it looked like the 5th of November rather than the 11th. They seem to be very casual about, or very relaxed about their attitudes. 7 took off, 2 collided on deck, and 1 was still airworthy, so they sent that off. But the second one took it down to the hangar, and it was repaired within 20 minutes. It was one of the wonderful things about the Swordfish. Just slap a bit more canvas on it and a bit more dope, check it round and send it off. It had 2 wings anyway, 4 wings, not 2, so as long as 3 worked, I'm sure it'll be fine. Anyway, another one came back when the fuel tank fell off, and that was unfortunate. It was strapped on the outside. The thing about the torpedo, by the way, they put the 60-gallon oil tank in the observer's seat. The observer's seat was the middle. The telegraphist there gunner sat in the back, facing aft with a Lewis gun, and the tanks were 60-gallon tank was put in the middle, so there was no telegraphist there gunner. The observer had to sit in the tag seat at the back, and navigating from the back in an open cockpit with a board on your knee is pretty horrible. I think going there wasn't too bad because, as I say, they could see everything with the fireworks display going on in front of them. But coming back to Illustrious must have been quite difficult. But they all did. The last aircraft to depart was at 9:45, and he arrived after the start, but he bombed the Trento. I don't think he did him much damage, put a hole in it. And Hale, who was one of the leaders of the second one, Ginger Hale, torpedoed the Littorio, and a couple more hits on the Caio Giulio and Littorio. They did do some damage, but it wasn't permanent. Unfortunately, one aircraft crashed in the Mar Grande, and unfortunately, Lieutenants Bailey and Slaughter were killed. So they're the only two killed in that whole of that action. There we are. You can see they crashed just there in the middle. But the damage they did, again, they did pretty well in the inside the mall. At one stage, they got so low they had to be really low because the guns of the ships couldn't fire downwards because they'd either hit other ships or the harbour or the town or whatever. And so one of them, I think it was Torrance Spence, as he came through the barrage balloons, he saw this great big shape in front of him, dropped his torpedo, and then gave a hard right, and his wheel actually touched the water, which the observer said was very interesting. But that's how the sort of flying they were doing. But the Swordfish is extremely maneuverable. Well, at the end, by 1:30 or 1:20, the first lot got back to Illustrious, and the final landing of that lot was at another half an hour later. 2:00, the second lot came. It's almost copybook, really. And at 2:50, the final one, who was probably the last one that took off, the one who needn't have gone but did. And it was suggested they went again the following day. Fortunately, the weather was bad, but I think ABC decided what he said at the bottom there. You know, they only asked the Light Brigade to do it once, and it would have been complete suicide. This keeps moving itself, not me moving it. Oh, those are participants. And I was saying I got interested in this when I was at Cold Rose because a couple of these chaps down the bottom, there's Sir Richard Janvrin later, Funak, Charles Lamb, David Goodwin, who was around, some of the other ones. Alfie Sutton, his son was in 845 with me as a jungly pilot. Going actually lost his legs later on when Illustrious was bombed in Malta. And I don't know if he continued flying. I don't think he did, but he survived. So having survived Taranto, then loses his legs later on. That was the damage. See the Littorio sitting on the bottom. I haven't got any pictures of all of them, but Caio Giulio looks fairly well underwater. They had a bit of trouble removing one of them because the divers discovered when they were trying to patch them up, there was a live torpedo sitting underneath, which hadn't gone off. So the Italians had a bit of a problem. Now, Mussolini apparently didn't seem to be particularly angry about it. Nobody understood why, but he was a strange man anyway. But when Adolf Hitler heard about it, he was absolutely furious. And he sent squadrons of Stukas, lots of them, over 100 of them, down to Sardinia, Greece, to the bottom of Italy, various airfields, and then got really angry. And this was towards the beginning of the year of 1941. And on the 16th of January, he attacked Illustrious. She was attacked at sea first and turned back towards Malta because felt that was the safest thing to do. And she got to, 6 days later, she got to Malta and was attacked again, where they, somehow, the Stukas managed to get 3 or 4 hits on the after flight deck, which actually went into the flight deck lift and did a lot of damage below. If it had hit the deck, they might not have done so much. But the Maltese did an incredible job. They repaired her to some sort of jury rig in the space of about 5 days. She then went off to Alexandria and was stored up and took no further part. She went off down to Norfolk in Virginia for repairs, and her sister ship, the Formidable, came the other way and replaced her. So what had happened was basically something that had been envisaged in the 1930s, although a lot of people think it encouraged people to do the same sort of thing. And of course, Prince of Wales and the Repulse was sunk after Pearl Harbor. Captain Leach, the father of Henry Leach, First Sea Lord and Captain of Albion when I was in her, he was killed, and he'd taken part in Prince of Wales, which was quite new then, in sinking the Bismarck a few months after this. We've all seen those pictures before, I'm sure. Pearl Harbor. Japanese really took it to heart. And Repulse, a fairly large battle cruiser, didn't stand a chance. No air cover. And Churchill always regretted that. It was one big mistake he made, considering he was remarkably pro-Navy. And after Gallipoli, I think he was fairly sensitive about things when he got sacked as First Lord of the Admiralty. Lovely ship, not very old, only about 18 months old when she got sunk. Main differences were we were actually at war with Italy, and the Japanese and Americans weren't at war. So Americans weren't expecting anything. Taranto was defensive. Pearl Harbor was, well, I suppose it was, both were offensive. And Taranto, the main thing was we did a lot of training in Swordfish at night. There was a lot of training at night. And quite a lot of people in those days didn't do much, but Lumley Lister and Dennis Boyd, who was actually not an aviator, but had learnt to fly, was very keen on it. And they did a lot of practice. And I just thought that's rather nice because she was roughly, Albion was laid down in 1944. She was roughly the same size, actually, as Illustrious, a bit more modern. She only had 2 screws, whereas Illustrious had 3, and she was a bit slower. And of course, had fixed wing on her before, and then was converted to a commando carrier, as was her sister ship, the Bulwark. And just a bit of nostalgia. It gave me the feel for the thing anyway, even though it wasn't a fixed wing. That's what the Americans use them for. And that's not a very good picture, but that's what we've got now. So the whole thing is completely different. And I won't even go there because there's some experts in the audience. But it's jolly nice to have them back. Well, that's basically the end of it. Not too much politics, I hope, and I hope it wasn't too confusing, all those lines, but I'm sure most pilots would read them and not necessarily understand them, like most of us didn't, but gave you a feel for it. Thanks very much for listening.
Richard, thank you so much for speaking. That was fantastic. Speaking from a personal note, obviously we knew about Taranto being naval officers or ex-naval officers, but we didn't know, I never knew very much about it. I mean, the flyboys would talk about it, and we just didn't get to know about it, but the importance of it. But it clearly was a very, very significant event in the history of the Fleet Air Arm.
What I was going to say, honestly, it's quite good thing that the October 21st wasn't successful that night, because doing it on November 11th means that the Royal Navy, especially Fleet Arm, can have 2 dinners in the autumn to celebrate rather than just one.
And as you know, the Navy marches on its stomach like the Army as well. So I think that was most interesting. It was so good to get a topic which is definitely not something that people think about much these days, and just put it in perspective as an example of actually what was happening at that stage of the war. The one thing that particularly interests me is the string bag side. As you know, I have a sort of fascination with, not fascination, not right word, with the idea of the Bismarck and the role that the Swordfish played in that campaign, not least because my first late father-in-law was a navigator bomb aimer in Wellington. He was sitting on an airstrip in Cork, ready to fly out to bomb the Bismarck. And he had a full payload of bombs and fuel, and he knew there wasn't enough to get back to shore again. So I'm very grateful in a way to the Fleet Air Arm for the fact that they actually gave me a wife at one stage.
Whether his bombs would have sunk the Bismarck, because as that American admiral said, it's better to let water in through the bottom than air in through the top.
That's very interesting. That's good. What was the record of the Swordfish really throughout the rest of the war? Did it have, apart from Matapan and Bismarck, as I say, which was an extraordinary event, and probably more fluke than anything, except there was a lot of courage and bravery in it. Were there other significant occasions when the Swordfish, the string bag, comes into its own?
Not that they continued on in service until 1944, but I think the biggest one was probably, they tried the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, of course, later after the Bismarck, when five Swordfish from, I think, Leon Solent tried to attack them in the Channel Dash. Eugene Esmond, who'd been actually on the Bismarck as well, he lost his life and was awarded a VC. And that's one thing I meant to mention. Of the medals they got, so I think there were 2 DSOs, a couple of DSCs, a few military medals, and a mention in dispatches. I think every single chap there should have got at least a DSO. And Williamson and the late Ginger Hill should have got VCs.
It's extraordinary.
Just quite extraordinary. Nobody really can explain why. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And to going a thing like that, knowing it's straight into the, the mouths of hell and get nothing, not even a mention of dispatches, is just unreal.
It's extraordinary. I think one of the things we think about as well, you said they came in at 70,000 feet, then had to come down to 100 feet. I mean, that itself at night time, flying.
Wings had to be level, otherwise the torpedo would enter at the wrong angle. If they were too high, it would sink to the bottom. If it was too low, it would bounce off the top. And if it wasn't actually 2 planes horizontal and 2 planes vertical, it'd probably go off at an angle. So, we all know the film of the Dam Busters, and how the sort of cross spotlights downwards gave the right depth or the right height for dropping the bouncing bomb. Was there any similar technology for the Sopwith to know when it was the right height if it was flying at night? I think on these you just looked out of the window, looked over the side. That's all they could do. The observer in the back did actually call out 500 feet on the way down, so the pilot would start to level out.
Yeah.
But that was the nearest, and there's a lag in the instruments. There were no radio altimeters.
Yeah.
And the instrument takes a bit of time to catch up.
That's incredible. Look, thank you so much for that. There'll be an opportunity at the end, but I hope there will be some questions. Fiona, can I go back to you? Have you managed to collect any questions at all?
It's Jenny, actually.
Oh, it's Jenny. I'm so sorry, Jenny.
Today. I've got 2 for you. Are there any swordfish left in museums that we could go and see?
The Fleet Arm Museum at Yeovilton and Navy Wings down there own a couple of them. I'm not quite sure how many are flying at the moment. I think it's 3 they've got altogether. And they fly regularly when they have air displays and things. They're quite careful with their amount of flying hours they do, but yeah, they fly regularly.
Thank you very much. And
So go down to Yeovilton.
Yeovilton, yeah. And another question, someone's interested in all the different helicopters that you flew. I know Alistair mentioned it in the beginning, but you've had quite a career with helicopter flying, haven't you?
Well, like most of the naval pilots, I know my brother's there, started off on Hiller 12Es, little bubble thing, military one, followed by a Whirlwind, which was a 50s Sikorsky torpedo dropper they were originally used for. And then on to Wessex 5s, with a twin-engined American design, but British built. Fine aircraft, those were the ones you saw in that picture of Albion. And then the Wasp, a small little torpedo dropper, which again dropped at about 100 feet, 90 knots, and flew those with the doors off. So it felt rather like being probably in a Swordfish, the nearest you could get to it. That's how I became a member of the Goldfish Club. And after that, things Hueys in Oman and some larger Bell helicopters and a couple of little Jet Ranger things flying around the deserts there and then in the hills, mountains. Followed by, when I finally got back to England, a thing called a Dauphin, which is one of the fastest helicopters there is, 200 miles an hour, about 180 knots. And that was the first air ambulance. It was only used because it had a certification to have a medical kit in the back. But now they've got a rather slightly slower one, but better singlet. You have to have twin engine over London or over towns. And so nowadays, most working helicopters have two engines and full instruments. So you can do automatic approaches in bad weather, things like that. No, it's come on a lot. And that was basically sum total of my helicopter flying.
Did you ever fly a Lynx, Richard?
No, thanks. I flown in one 2 days before it crashed with the Vice Admiral in it. Came out to Oman, took us out to the ship for lunch, took us back, and the following couple of days later, it crashed and just off Muscat.
Oh, good heavens.
And we went to visit him in hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I didn't like them personally. I didn't like the look of them. But there are plenty of chaps watching, I'm sure, who've flown them and loved them.
Sure. Do you mind if I ask you another question? I think that's good. Has that covered the range of aircraft? As far as your flying latterly is concerned with the air ambulance, you were obviously flying some very tight spots when you were serving, whatever, not least with commandos.
Yeah.
Were there similarities between flying with the military and flying with the air ambulance as well?
Well, when we started the air ambulance, we thought it was very similar until the Civil Aviation Authority, otherwise known as the Campaign Against Aviation, told us we were landing in places far too tight. So they limited us a little bit. One didn't go quite so often in between the traffic lights anymore. But the size we were allowed was basically the size of a tennis court, with a net down, of course.
Yeah, sure.
So that was about the right minimum size. But if we went any closer, they would get annoyed, which I suppose is quite right. We have to have two engines as well and be able to fly away on one or land on one, so there's no danger to the public.
Would you use the river as a sort of conduit for flying quickly?
With two engines, we're allowed to go any direction we wanted. But normally, if we weren't just going from the hospital to Battersea for a refuel, just go along the river.
Yeah.
Because there are heli routes all the way around London, and if you were on one of them, the air traffic at Heathrow know where you are, and they don't worry about it. If you're on the routes and you're certain heights and at certain places, they leave you alone.
Oh, that's excellent.
Can I just say that Peter says there's a Swordfish at Shearwater, Halifax, Nova Scotia.
I heard there was one in Canada. I wasn't sure. Some said there are about 8 or 9 of them, but maybe there are some. I don't know. But there are 2 regularly flying out of Yeovilton, and they're in very good condition.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Bill White here. I've heard that Taranto was considered the model by the Japanese for Is this true, do you know?
I think it had all been discussed before the war, but when they saw what happened at Taranto, it certainly encouraged them.
Hmm.
And Fiona wants to know.
No,
it's not you.
No, it was actually sent to me from Nick Tyndall.
Would you like to read it out?
Yes.
Nick. Yeah.
What's the best Taranto dinner you've been to and why?
Best time to do what?
What's the best Taranto dinner you've been to and why?
Well, I think probably the first one when Sir Richard Janvrin was talking. I just joined the Fleet Air Arm, but there was another one where they used to, at Culdrose in the old mess there, string wires across the mess. And when the guest speaker was talking about them, they had model Swordfish, which zoomed down from somewhere off to behind you, went across in front, and they had thunder flashes or some small explosives, squibs, underneath them. So there were lots of bangs and crashes. And of course, being the Fleet Air Arm, it slightly degenerated into bun throwing and, anti-submarine pilots having a go at commando pilots or vice versa. So we don't really talk about this. It wasn't really correct conduct. But those the best ones were at Culdrose.
I'm guessing it's somebody who knows about the dinners.
Exactly. I've got a remote question here. I'm not sure, Roger, whether you're on. This is Roger Höfling, good friend to the Wellington. He says, two immediate questions, if I may. First of all, this one's really for Richard. Well, it's a family feud. He says, do you know if the speaker, that's you, is related to Richard Ormond Shuttleworth, 1909 to 1940, perhaps?
We're not, in fact, not that I know of. My father tried to find out, but I think they came from a farming family up in York or Lincolnshire, and they invented a thing. Clayton and Shuttleworth, two farmers, invented basically the traction engine and the first tractor steam. Made a huge lot of money in the early 1800s. They were like Fords in America. All these traction engines, and they bought a huge estate in Bedfordshire, where the Shuttleworth Trust is now.
Mm.
And when he was, I think he was born in about 1911, joined the cavalry after Eton, inherited the estate because his father was quite old. He inherited the estate quite young, and went off and became a semi-professional racing driver before the war. And when war was looming, he was in the cavalry, had been in the cavalry, and when war started, he decided he'd like to become a pilot. And whilst he was training, sadly, one night, he was killed in an accident. I'm not sure what the aircraft was, but it was a trainer, and he unfortunately never got as far as going into action. And his elderly mother, he was the only son, formed the Shuttleworth Trust, and there's an agricultural college there. And he had a collection of old cars, but also started collecting elderly aircraft. And some of the oldest flying aircraft in the world are at Shuttleworth at Old Warden. It's worth going to.
It's worth noting that. Thank you very much.
Richard, you've clearly shown why, as I speak as an old gunnery officer, Taranto changed the shape of the Navy, and why the Fleet Air Arm clearly put so much emphasis on it. I think it was fantastic to hear it all.
Yes,
but is that your view as well, that it did reshape the Navy of today back in 1940?
It did, because I know you're a gunnery officer, Steve, and ABC, I think, was a gunnery officer.
Yep.
In fact,
changed him.
Yeah, they all were into big guns because that's what had happened since Trafalgar, when we've the fastest rearming or redoing weapons, reloading weapons 4 times as fast as the French and Spanish. And I think that mentality went right on until, and I know that Matapan, I think ABC particularly felt that he would rather like to have a battleship against a battleship, which I don't think actually happened, because the Vittorio Veneto, which wasn't sunk at Taranto, she got away and then disappeared. And of course, Taranto was actually empty after all this because they all went up to Naples and Genoa.
Mm.
So yes, I think it did change it.
Yeah.
But we lagged behind. We had such antiquated aircraft, but the Navy just were given these things and they did their best with them.
Yeah.
I think they did rather well.
Can I say something?
Yes, please do come in.
It's good to see you, Richard. Very enjoyable. Can I just say, this is very poignant for me. I was 80 over the weekend, and my daughter gave me the original copy of the Times for my birth date, which was the 9th of January. And I've got it open in front of me. And it's the day of, Richard mentioned about the Stuka's attack.
Attacking the illustrious, yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, the news was completely censored at that time. So there's no kind of bad things. But there's some interesting comment. Just one I'll read you. A striking feature of the British advance into Libya has been the ineffectiveness of the Italian air opposition. So that made a tremendous difference there. This is 2 months after the Taranto battle. And then they say the RAF has now, and the Navy now has complete sea command, and the Navy's vital work going on from Tobruk. So, and there are one or two things in here that mention the effect that Taranto must have had in the course of the war. So I'll read some more of this myself later on. I've only just opened it, but it's quite fascinating.
Thank you very much, Ed. That's a lovely introduction.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. It's interesting talking about the ineffectiveness of the Italian Air Force, because certainly when it came to the time of Operation Pedestal, the convoy to Malta, the famous one with the American ship that was requisitioned. Ohio. Yeah. Thank you. The Italian Air Forces, I think, played absolute havoc then, as did some of those 105 submarines as well. The Eagle, which was hit, I don't know if it was hit by the Axis, whether it was German, a U-boat, or whether it was Italian, but it was hit by 4 torpedoes and sank in 6 minutes. It's appalling. So it was never a safe place, the Mediterranean. I think that's fantastic. I like the idea of some people who turned on and have questions. Is there anybody else who would like to actually just come live and put a final question, let's say, to Richard? Time is marching on a bit. We're now sort of 20-ish to 8, and perhaps should draw to a close on the formal. If there's nobody,
we still have 84 people.
Oh, we do.
Logged in. So
that's fantastic.
They're still awake.
Well, anybody who would like to fire another question, by all means, come down to 100 feet and let go at 120 knots and give it to him. Well, there we are. Maybe that's time to move on, Richard. I think you've done splendidly. I'm terribly sorry that by the time of the 16th lecture, hopefully Zoom and various other things will approve, so we can actually get slides moving easily from one to the other. It's always a distraction for the speaker. But thank you so much again for what you've done. You filled in definitely, for me, a missing bit of rather important history. And I think it's been a fascinating lecture. I think that we'll try and do something that's been done online. If people would like to turn on, why don't we show our appreciation, as they say, in the usual way? So turn on your microphones, turn on your videos, and let's give him a great clap. Thank you so much.
Bravo. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Richard.
I've got a question myself. I was wondering if anybody, has there ever been a film made about Taranto?
We know who to talk to if there hasn't been. At least I do.
You've had the Dam Busters, had Sink the Bismarck, but have we ever had a Taranto?
I bet it hasn't been. But I think that's an interesting question. We might follow that one up, Richard. I know somebody who might be interested in doing that.
Great.
Jenny, would you like to round up?
Yes.
Okay.
if I may. The next lecture is on the 8th of February, Monday the 8th of February. And it's Kevin Maynard, the station manager from RNLI Tower Lifeboat Station. So that's the next one coming up. And you'll all be receiving an invitation to that in due course. And of course, it wouldn't be me if I didn't make a plug for donations. Thank you so much, all of you who've made a donation so far. It makes such a difference to us in our preservation and running of the ship expenses. So please help us if you can.
Right-hand corner.
And I think that's probably the end, Alistair. If you'd
That's
like to say
wonderful.
goodbye.
Thank you, Jenny, very much. And thank you for all your hard work, and you and Fee and Matt's behind all this lot as well. And thank you, all of you, the remaining 77, 78. At one stage, I counted there were up to 129 people online. That, I think, Richard, we can applaud you as saying as being a record. It's been absolutely, and actually swelled by the presence of your brothers as well. One of you I just saw. I think it's been a wonderful evening. I'm so grateful for you all coming, and I echo what Jenny was saying about your kind donations as well, those who've done so. You're welcome back next time. We'll hope to try and have it going even more smoothly, if smooth was the word. Meanwhile, if you'd like to stay around and talk to those who want to stay on, turn on your sound, click off your microphone debarments, come on to video, and over to you. And very good health. Richard, you're very good health.
And yours.
Well done, Richard. Lovely to see you there. Thank you.